Good evening. We appreciate your attendance. We appreciate your being part of the one team. As you know, we've got the one fight. That would be the 2020 fight. We would ask you to help us grow the team so we can have a victory this year in the determination of the future of our country and our children and grandchildren. Tonight, we're going to hear a very important topic from David Boris, who is a co-founder of the Sharia Crime Stoppers. David is a retired police chief with many years of experience in civilian law enforcement. And prior to that, he was in the U.S. Army with lots of experience with security and law enforcement on military bases. The topic tonight is from Pensacola to Hezbollah. The threat is within the wire. So David is going to take us through a better understanding of the sleeper cells that are in America, how they get into America, how they find residence and take up activity. We're even going to include an in-depth analysis and information on the infiltration by sleeper cells related to Pensacola and the tragedy that occurred there back in December. So very proud to have David Boris as our co-founder and our presenter for this evening.
Well, thank you, Dick, for that introduction. And for tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about the threat that's already inside the wire here within the United States, from Pensacola to Hezbollah. I'll remind our viewers that there are two axes of the jihadist threat to the United States. The first is the extreme or radical jihad, the so-called direct attack, the violent attack, and that's what we're going to be primarily focusing on this evening. But we also have to be reminded of the indirect or soft jihad that's promulgated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, both of these axes of attack complement each other. One to lure us, one to terrorize us. So for the purposes of tonight's broadcast, I want to refer to this document recently published by the Department of Homeland Security, their new strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence in the United States. Let's unpack this a little bit and see what it has to tell us and how they're going to go about protecting us from the threat that's already in our midst. They identify three categories of threat. They call them major threat actors, and the very first one is labeled the radical Islamist threat, the radical Islamist terrorist threat. Now, I have a problem with radical because the Islamist terrorist threat is normative Islam. There's nothing radical about it. It is mainstream Islam. But be that as it may, the Department of Homeland Security identifies many groups, all that we are familiar with: ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the inspiration that they provide for homegrown independent jihadists. So just as an example of one is the most recent attack that occurred on December 6, 2019, by a Saudi Air Force officer at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. Earlier this year, the founder of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was killed by a drone attack, but not before he took credit for the attack and said that his organization was responsible for inspiring, motivating the attacker. After the drone attack, our Attorney General came out with this assessment. He said very clearly that the attack in Pensacola was an act of terrorism and that he was motivated, Mohammed Saeed al-Shmarami was motivated by Islamic jihadist ideology. I don't want to glance over that because this is a huge admission by a senior administration official, an admission that is really the first time that this has occurred in two administrations since 9/11 and 2001, that we've actually equated a terrorist attack and having a nexus to Islam. Well, there have been plenty of other examples we could use of the Islamic terrorist threat to this country, many of these in Florida. The first, Adolfo Solano, who plotted to attack the Dolphin Mall in Miami. Harlem Schwartz plotted to detonate a backpack bomb in Key West Beach. James Gonzalo Medina plotted to bomb the Aventura Turnberry Jewish Center with an AK-47. And of course, we all know about Omar Mateen, who attacked the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. And then Esteban Santiago attacked passengers at Fort Lauderdale Airport on January 18th, 2017. So those are just some examples of the Islamic terrorist threat that's outlined in the Department of Homeland Security document. The second category, the second leg of our stool of major threat actors, are called domestic terrorists. These are individuals that select their targets based on race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, or gender. These are also lone actors who strike by themselves. Some examples: the Tree of Life attack in Pittsburgh by Robert Bowers, killing 11 individuals. Another example is the anti-government, anti-authority of domestic terrorists like Antifa, and the attempted firebombing of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility in Tacoma, Washington earlier this year. Another recent arrest of 3 white supremacist members of the group called the Base, who promote a white ethno-state violence against blacks and Jews. And then we have a Bernie Sanders acolyte, Kyle Jarrett, a field organizer for his campaign, caught in an undercover video threatening violence if Bernie Sanders is not the Democratic nominee or elected as President of the United States. So what we have here is an example of the normalization of political violence in this country as an acceptable response by those who have opposing viewpoints. Well, let's pause for a moment and see what makes the Islamic jihadist threat different from all the others that are mentioned in the Department of Homeland Security's strategic plan. The first major difference is that the Islamic threat is a global movement, and as of 9/11 is far more deadly. It's important to recognize that many times when people start counting the casualties that are caused by terrorists, at least for the Islamic threat, they start on 9/12. They omit the nearly 3,000 people who were murdered on 9/11. And as we'll see later, there are far more casualties as a result of the Islamic threat in the United States that aren't even being considered. Jihadist groups have all declared war on the United States, while the Muslim Brotherhood entities are attempting to subvert our Constitution through civilization jihad. Another major difference is they all justify their actions as a noble cause through their doctrine of Islam. Many jihadists are targeting specifically non-Muslim women and children for violence through rape and sexual attacks, pedophilia, and they're targeting Christians and Jews for genocide. All of the followers promote a host of Sharia-sanctioned crimes, many of which we'll take a look at later in this broadcast. Most jihadists are willing to die for their cause, the fighting martyr, to impose their will on non-believers. And lastly, they have a 1,400-year history of violence against non-Muslims for us to take a closer look at. So those are the major differences between this form of terrorism from all the others, and in my humble opinion, make it a far worse threat to the United States. Our third major threat actors identified by the Department of Homeland Security are referred to as targeted violence. These are non-ideological individuals who kill for no apparent reason, such as the attack in South Florida by Nicholas Cruz, and also the recent attack at a Walmart in California. So those are the threats to the homeland that the Department of Homeland Security has identified. What we'll talk about next are the threats to the homeland that are not identified. And the very first one is Shia Hezbollah, and we'll take a little closer look at that. Shia Hezbollah, remember, is a Lebanon group sponsored by Iran through its Revolutionary Guard Force. It's a proxy of Iran, and it's very active along our southern border. In fact, it has three principal funding sources: synthetic opioids and cocaine that are killing thousands of Americans every year. And those deaths need to be included in the body count, if you will, of why this threat is so much worse than any other terrorist threat to the homeland. They also employ human sex trafficking and counterfeit medicine, as well as employing sleeper cells throughout the United States. So as for cocaine, they're moving tons of it throughout Latin America and Europe to finance their terrorist operations. Back on November 13, 2017, the Washington Post reported that New York City has become the center for fentanyl in the Northeast. Remember that New York City is a sanctuary jurisdiction, and 80% of the seizures are traced to Sinaloa cartel and transported via our interstate system after being smuggled across the borders of California and Texas. The CDC reports that synthetic opioid deaths rose 846% between 2010 and 2017, when 28,000 Americans died from these drugs. And on August 15th of last year, the Congressional Research Service reported that the number of casualties is much higher. In 2017, 72,000 overdose deaths occurred, with 47,000 linked to opioids. So we've got Hezbollah and the drug cartels directly behind the introduction of opioids into the United States. Why aren't these deaths being counted? Well, as for the drug cartels themselves, many groups are active in northern Mexico, allied with Hezbollah, to bring more and more drugs into the United States. As this map shows, the areas in red are where there are travel security risks, the very areas where the narco jihadists and cartels operate. So the dangerous triangle is this three-country location of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, where the drugs are inserted, where Hezbollah conducts its operation and has its bases, bringing the drugs up through time-honored routes, and of course through the caravans into Texas and other southern states. In 2012, this report was issued by the House Committee on Homeland Security, and it warned about the problem of illegal drugs being smuggled across the southern border. Notice I said the report was issued in 2012, and still there's resistance to the wall to this day. Let's turn to sex trafficking. After drug trafficking, sex trafficking is the second most lucrative business in Mexico, a business endorsed by the drug cartels and Hezbollah. Many of the victims end up in our cities. The journey starts here. The children of women sold into prostitution are often held hostage to ensure that their mothers fulfill their quotas. The victims are commonly very young, from 15 to 25 years of age. The network for human sex trafficking is controlled by the drug cartels and the jihadists. To cross the border into Arizona, coyotes receive $4,500 per head, and each person has to pay an additional $700 in tax to the cartels. The United Nations Security Council has issued reports about the problem of targeting women for enslavement, forced conversions, prostitutions. all for the purpose of shaming them, humiliating them, infecting them with HIV, and stigmatizing them. So women are the ultimate terror tool for jihadists. And we have to look no further than Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation that is supporting CARE, and Islamic Relief, all tying into this sex trafficking, supporting it. Georgetown University activist and convert to Islam, Professor Jonathan Brown, defended Sharia-sanctioned rape and sex slavery at a CARE fundraiser. Another report issued by this young lady, Nikita Malik, of the Henry Jackson Society in Great Britain. The use of sexual violence by terrorist organizations has become widespread, systematic, and strategic. The use of rape, sexual slavery, and forced marriage to bolster recruits is a recruiting ploy and to galvanize fighters and punish us, the non-believers. So it remains a clear driver behind sexual trafficking is its financial gain in providing millions of dollars to terrorist organizations worldwide. Just one example of the multi-state sex trafficking ring, this one along the I-95 corridor, recently sentenced to life in prison. So people have been warning about rape being used by jihadists against Western women for years. We're going to cover this topic a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. So sex trafficking is a Sharia-sanctioned crime. It's embedded within Islamic law. It's authorized in the Quran by chapter 33, verse 50, and others, and by the very recorded deeds and words of Muhammad. An undercover BBC News investigation found that Instagram and Google Play are promoting an online sex market. The third main source for Hezbollah was reported by Case Western Reserve University back in 2015, and previously by the Clarion Project in 2012. Hezbollah has diversified by manufacturing a counterfeit form of Capagon used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. The network behind the operation is extensive. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime reported that over 23.6 tons of fake Capagon was seized in the Middle East in 2009 alone. So now that we have an idea of how Hezbollah is financing and funding its operations, let's take a look at sleeper cells. On April 17, 2018, the Washington Free Beacon reported information about Hezbollah sleeper cells in the United States. Following that, on May 17th of last year, another report about Hezbollah's safe havens for terrorists and a continent-wide terror infrastructure to strike the United States. And finally, on October 15th, 2019, another warning reported by World Daily News. 3 recent arrests of Hezbollah sleeper cell members, Ali Korani, along with another cell member, Samar al-Derek, both serving as an advance party to identify targets for Hezbollah agents here in the United States. Both were members of the Islamic Jihad organization, a component of Hezbollah, responsible for conducting terrorist operations outside of Lebanon. It's also known as Unit 910. Another member, Alexei Saab, was arrested July 9th of last year, charged in a 9-count indictment for offenses supporting Hezbollah. And reported on November 5th of last year by the Clarion Project, more warnings about sleeper cells infiltrating the United States. So Hezbollah, the Party of God, is sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran, is considered the world's leading narco-terrorist organization. While it uses synthetic opioids to kill U.S. citizens and to raise money, and along with human sex trafficking and counterfeit medicine, we are funding Hezbollah operations in the United States that are killing thousands of Americans every year. Before Soleimani was killed recently by a drone attack, he issued this warning to President Trump. "We are closer to you than you think." Now, what was he trying to communicate to us? He was trying to communicate that he's embedded sleeper cells in our own backyard. And now the threat is closer. Taking steps to counter it was the mayor of New York, along with many other major cities, recognizing that these sleeper cells exist and taking added security measures to counter them. Because of Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, a congressional field hearing was conducted back in 2018 near Pensacola by our State Department and issued a warning that threatens Florida because of the drug cartels that we've already been talking about. So none of this Hezbollah threat, none of the alliance with narco-terrorists, and none of the sleeper cells embedded within the United States is covered in the Department of Homeland Security countering terrorist strategy. Coupled with that, we still have the purge to deal with. Remember, we've talked extensively about the purge of federal training since 2011 and 2012 of all federal law enforcement, Department of Defense, and Homeland Security, and FBI personnel are not receiving any meaningful training about this threat to the homeland. Absent the comments by the Attorney General Barr recently over the Pensacola attack, we are left that there is no nexus of terrorism to Islam. So what has been the effect of the purge? Well, first, we were relying on the Council of American Islamic Relations to train law enforcement. We know the Council of American Islamic Relations is an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. It's a front for Hamas, and they're training our Border Patrol and Customs officers. And then there's the FBI, who refuses to consider the possible link of Islam to the Las Vegas attack in order to understand the motive. Another impact of this purge is the impact or the effect on training at the local level. CARE will push back against any training that's offered to local law enforcement by calling it Islamophobic, racist, inaccurate, and they get the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement to accept the fact that no credits will be granted to law enforcement officers who attend this training. This is a national problem. I can only go back to March of 2018, having received the same types of threats, the same types of pressure when I was scheduled to give training at a sheriff's office here in the state of Georgia. So returning to the Council of American Islamic Relations, following the Holy Land Foundation trial, this is what the presiding judge, Judge Jorge Solis, said about CARE. It is a criminal organization that supports terrorism, and yet we're using it, this very organization, to train local law enforcement. So let's take a look at CARE in a little bit more detail in Florida. You remember the previous sheriff who was relieved by Governor Santos of his following the the lone gunman attack in South Florida, he hired a senior CARE official in CARE Florida, Nizar Hamzi, as a deputy. Well, Hamzi has since left CARE Florida to form his own group, the South Florida Muslim Federation. It's an umbrella group of South Florida's many Muslim organizations to include CARE, Islamic Relief, the Islamic Circle of North America, all affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. And he sits right at the top of that organization while serving as a deputy sheriff in Broward County. Well, this is a part-time job for him, being in charge of this organization. As its second meeting last March, many attendees had strong links to terrorism. The question before us is, should Hamzi be allowed to be a deputy sheriff with these types of credentials? At least one state in the United States is severing ties with outreach to CARE. But again, it's only a recommendation, it's not a law, it's a resolution that law enforcement should not have outreach to CARE. Speaking of Hamzi, he recently met with representatives of the U.S. Attorney's Office of Southern District of Florida and CARE leaders, Wilfredo Amir Ruiz. Remember, the FBI has at least publicly said that it's no longer affiliating with CARE, and yet the Department of Justice is doing just that. But we're not through with Hamzi yet. Here he's providing weapons training in a mosque reported on December 6, 2015. We have a problem with that. When I gave training to law enforcement officers in Tampa a few months back, one of the officers said, "How is this any different than us providing active shooter training at a local church, at a local synagogue, or at a Catholic parish?" The main difference is that violence is being promulgated in mosques. I know of no church, no synagogue, and certainly no Catholic parish where violence is being promulgated against non-believers. But such violence is being promoted through the doctrine of jihad. So now we're going to listen to a recent interview conducted by Christopher Wright of Dave Galbetz, who went into the two mosques in Pensacola, Florida, undercover, to see what kind of information he could find out about what's being promulgated at those facilities. So let's pause for a minute and take a look at this interview.
We're here today with Dave Galbetz, former U.S. Air Force and federal agent and author of Muslim Mafia, Inside the Secret Underworld That's Conspiring to Islamize America, published in 2008. Dave, Islam is supposed to be the religion of peace. How could any mosque be considered dangerous in America?
Well, first of all, people really need to understand that Islam is not peaceful, it's not loving, it's not caring, and it's based on my work within Islam and going to mosques for over 40 years, since the 1970s. There's nothing within Islam that advocates love and caring for non-Muslims. You have child marriages, you have physical jihad and other factors which are stressed in each and every mosque, well above the love and peace for the world.
You've been in 375 mosques in the U.S. What have you found overall, and based on what?
I've found in 375 mosques in the U.S. and over 100 mosques outside of the U.S. that they have material, and I never used the Quran as my evidence because that's 1,400 years ago, but they have current material advocating what I just mentioned, child marriages, advocating killing Christians and Jews anywhere throughout the world, advocating physical jihad, terrorism throughout the world, and to have an Islamic Ummah nation under Sharia law in place, not just in the Middle East, but in America and in Israel and all through the world, an Islamic Ummah under Sharia law.
Well, anybody can write a pamphlet. How authoritative are these materials that you're finding inside U.S. mosques?
When I find the materials in 90% of the mosques, and most of the materials are stamped from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and for the Shia, Iran, most of these materials are very authoritative. They are accepted by the Islamic scholars throughout the world and endorsed by essentially their headquarters for the Sunni, Saudi Arabia.
How do you get inside these mosques? Are you a Muslim?
I'm not a Muslim. I've did 5 conversions, pseudo-conversions into Islam, but I've studied Islam for 40 years. I'm an Arabic linguist. I am essentially Sharia compliant. And that is that I know Sharia, I know how to dress in Sharia, I understand wudu, the cleansing of the body. So when I go into a mosque, I understand essentially Islam as well as the majority of the Muslims in the mosque. So I fit in. I have no problems going into a mosque. I'm very comfortable.
Well, you rate many American mosques as dangerous. How concerned should the general public be?
The general public should be very concerned. When I rate them dangerous or extremely dangerous, I am saying essentially that they are a terrorist sleeper cell. And when the time comes, when they get the call for action, some form of jihad, it's going to be carried out in America. It's not going to be carried out just against one political party. It's going to be carried out against all non-Muslims throughout America. They should be very, very concerned.
You were asked to evaluate mosques in Pensacola, Florida after the shooting at the Naval Station. You found them to be extremely dangerous. And what is that based on?
That's based on the material that I found in the mosque, talking with some of the Islamic leaders and some of the worshipers and putting it all together. I've got about 26 factors that I look at, Sharia compliance, and this mosque, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, would be very proud of the mosque in Pensacola. So the Saudi terrorists who attended these mosques, the one that killed and murdered the innocent people at the naval station, it was no surprise except to the media and senior law enforcement. But if you go to these mosques, you were trained essentially to do exactly what the Saudi terrorists did, and that is to kill innocent people.
So let's be very clear. Are you saying there is a proven connection between the Saudi shooter and the Pensacola mosques?
My understanding is that this individual, the Saudi shooter, attended these 2 mosques that I went to in Pensacola, and that's why I was asked by locals to go there.
You've done a lot of work on American mosques. Where can people go to learn more information?
I have a new site coming out within the next 2 weeks, and it's called America's Civil War Rising, RISING.org. America's Civil War Rising.org.
Very good. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Hi, now that we've seen what Dave Galbetz uncovered at the Pensacola Mosque, let's take a little closer look. Here are some of the documents, the materials that he mentioned as being authoritative publications that promote violence in these mosques. Now, there are many others. In fact, there's one that we could add, but I'll let you try to guess what it could be. If any of you have any ideas, please let us know by email of what another possible document, authoritative document within Islam that promotes violence that could be added to this list. Pay close attention to the last one I just put up because we'll take a closer look at it in just a few moments. So, mosques. In addition to violent literature, we can also take a look at what children are being taught in mosques. An authoritative report published by the Center for Religious Freedom that most school literature textbooks are funded by Saudi Arabia, and they all have these common themes. Now, how does that get played out? We can turn to Philadelphia, the Islamic Center of Philadelphia, late last year when young children put on a little skit promoting martyrdom, decapitations of Jews for Allah, hate speech, and again, martyrdom. The blood of the martyrs is calling us. So when Dave Galbetz issues one of his reports or affidavits labeling a mosque as either dangerous or extremely dangerous, what action steps should we take? What can we take? If you take a close look at one of these reports, nothing is mentioned in there that is illegal. Everything within one of Dave Galbetz's reports is protected speech. Well, one police chief became proactive, police chief in Irving, Texas. He addressed the problem head on. He's reminding parishioners of their obligation to report any child abuse, any pedophilia. Remember, child abuse and pedophilia are Sharia-sanctioned crimes. And he's reminding the parishioners of their obligation to follow U.S. law and report such criminal acts. Now, he could go on and remind the parishioners of all the Sharia-sanctioned crimes, such as polygamy, wife abuse, wife beating, female genital mutilation. This would be an ideal forum to put people on notice that we know what your doctrine authorizes, but it's also against the law. Now take a close look at the bookcase behind this police chief. How many of the books in there do you think are promoting violence? And does the police chief even know about it? Another way that we can respond to a Dave Galbetz report is the way it was done in New Hampshire. But before we get to that, we can go public with the findings. We can go public with Dave Galbetz's findings. We can go to the local media. We can go to local public officials. One way to do that and be guaranteed that you'll have an audience is to go to a city council meeting or a county commission meeting in your jurisdiction. And most of these meetings allow for public comment. Sign up for the public comment and then go public with the findings of Dave Galbetz's reports. Many of these commission meetings and city council meetings are televised. It's been my experience that every one of these meetings has media officials there, as well as elected officials and other concerned citizens. So it's a good way to promote the findings of what Dave Galbetz has found, and to hand out copies of the report as well. Another action step is visit local libraries and see if any of these so-called or authoritative publications are present, and then provide findings to the IRS, and hopefully, over time, we will get their tax-exempt status released. The unfortunate fact that we have to face is this one, that we are so infected with political correctness that some police chiefs will go out of their way to defend the local mosque, even when Dave Galbetz finds them dangerous or extremely dangerous, as occurred at the Islamic Center of New Hampshire. In June 30th, 2017, Dave Galvez went to the mosque at the behest of local citizens and reported his findings to the police chief, who went out of his way to defend the local mosque. Now, Dave Galvez has written extensively about mosques in his book, The Muslim Mafia. And one of the documents that he uncovered at the Islamic Society of New Hampshire was this one, the one that I showed you a few minutes ago. So what were some of the key passages that we find in this book? First is that the history of the Nation of Islam is a tale of blood. Islam wishes to press into service all the forces which can bring about revolution, and the term for the use of these forces is jihad. Then it highlights chapter 9, verse 33, the religion of truth shall be made dominant over all religions. The book goes on, the objective of Islamic jihad is to eliminate the rule of an un-Islamic system and establish an Islamic system of state rule. And the second part of that quote, the goal of such an all-embracing doctrine is bound to be world revolution. Truth cannot be confined to geographical borders. Two terms, offensive and defensive, by which the nature of warfare is differentiated, are not applicable to jihad. And then finally, it is offensive because the Muslim party assaults the rule of an opposing ideology, and it is defensive because the Muslim party is constrained to capture state power. And lastly, the objectives of this attack is to abolish the government which sustains these principles or beliefs contrary to Sharia. So Dave's conclusions. The Islamic Society of New Hampshire is a Sunni Saudi Pakistani front for Islamic-based terrorists. This mosque had very violent materials that advocate the overthrow of America. It has the same literature, the same manuals that terrorist groups use overseas for their own training. So on a scale of 1 to 10, Dave rated this mosque a 10 and found that it was a potential safe haven for sleeper cells. So lastly, it's imperative law enforcement use legal means to fully investigate the leadership of this mosque, which should be closed down immediately. This takes political will. This takes courage to do it. So conclusions about mosques. They're more than houses of worship. They represent the axis of the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood here within the United States. Their term, that if you don't have Sharia compliant indicators, chances are you don't have violence being promoted. But as Dave is very quick to point out in his reports, he's looking for the levels of Sharia compliance, and he finds it compelling. So is due diligence worth the adverse publicity? Because we'll face an awful lot of pushback. One breath of fresh air on the horizon is a House Resolution 160, drafted and promoted by Representative Jim Banks of Indiana. In this resolution, he singles out for concern the Islamic Circle of North America Muslim Brotherhood Front Group. It is openly affiliated with the Pakistani group Jamaat al-Islami, who Phil Haney has talked about extensively on previous webinars. And also it labels the Helping Hand for Relief and Development and its association with a Pakistani foundation that is on a designated terrorist organization list since 2016. Florida has a couple of other elected officials who understand the threat. One is Representative Diaz-Balart, and following following the governor, Ron DeSantis himself. Both of these individuals have been very active in trying to get the Muslim Brotherhood labeled a terrorist organization. It is still bogged down in House committees. So Sun Tzu warned us a long time ago, if you don't know yourself and if you don't know the enemy, you're going to lose in every battle. So before closing, let me just give a couple of words of caution. I've spent a lot of time this evening talking about the Islamic threat. I haven't talked about the Muslim threat. What I'm trying to convey to you is that there are many Muslims, and I think the majority in this country are peaceful, law-abiding. They have a great deal to lose and a great deal to fear from the jihadists. They can all be labeled as apostates and then subject to being killed. But nonetheless, they deserve our protection. But then we have these, the fundamentalists or the Islamists themselves that believe in strictly following normative Islam, and they are financing and helping to promote the Muslim Brotherhood and other jihadist organizations. And then we have those who are believing in the return to strict Salafi beliefs as promulgated by Muhammad, the return of Islam as it was originally founded. And then at the top of our pyramid, those who are promoting violence. Another caution is, we're told that Islam is a religion, therefore is fully protected. Well, the truth is always in the details. As we said from the outset, there are a variety of Sharia sanctioned crimes that you can find throughout the Quran, throughout the recorded words and deeds of Muhammad, that are authorized by Islamic law. All of these crimes represent a violation of U.S. law and are not protected and should be resisted at every turn. Yet thousands of Americans continue to support and defend Islam as a religion of peace. Out of ignorance? Maybe. So some action steps that could be taken. Number one, brief elected officials and law enforcement officials about what you've seen. Make sure that outreach to CARE and other Muslim Brotherhood is stopped. Take a closer look at House Resolution 160. Just Google it and you can read it for yourself. And then get your local representatives to support it. And then as we saw last week with Dr. Steve Kirby, challenge Muslims running for elected office. Use the information in Steve's book for a reference point and take them to task. So that concludes tonight's webinar about the threat within the wire. And as you've seen, much of it is not even being considered by the Department of Homeland Security. With that, I will sign off. Good night.